that seeking for happiness is seeking for happiness through pleasure. And that means that there's a wrong idea of what happiness for the human being is, which actually stems from a wrong idea of what the human being is, what we are. So as that movement towards happiness is corrected, so that it becomes a movement to what happiness for the human being really is, by default, as we correct one mistake, the idea of who we are that's not quite right tends to fall away, and a realization of what we are comes into view. What gets in the way of realizing what we really are is this idea that we are a separate independent entity that is controlling what happens through us in each moment. And it can be really simple to see that where this is not actually right, where what we are is not the orchestrator of our actions, but rather life is living through us. And even though I say it can be really simple, the magic of this story of life is that it has covered up something that is really simple in order to create a false idea of who we are, and then suffering stems from that. And one of the ways that we can come to see that we're not the orchestrator is if awareness lands on a fact that impulses arise moment after moment. A feeling inside the body, a feeling to do this or that, an impulse to move towards one thing versus the other. And that impulse can take many different forms. For example, the impulse of hunger can arise, and hunger will drive us towards food. Or an impulse of loneliness will arise, which will drive us towards companionship. An impulse of tiredness that will drive us towards sleeping. Or we can have a thought that arises that says, I need to do this. And that will drive us towards doing what the thought says we need to do. So if awareness can land on the fact that these impulses arise during the day, but where do they come from? The assumption is that they are my impulse. And therefore what happens after the impulse, which is driven by the impulse, must be my action. It can really be something as simple as recognizing intellectually that this is not my impulse, or at least it is my impulse. It's Roger's hunger. It's not John's hunger or Peter's hunger or Mary's hunger. But is it Roger's hunger that Roger created, or rather an impulse that Roger is feeling? So if we come to see these movements that we used to relate to as my doing, and really just observe them as, wow, they're not so much something I create, but something that happens. A bit like the heart pumping. We don't control that, it's just a biological function that happens. And the liver cleansing, we don't control what the liver does and how it works. It just happens. Then there are other biological impulses like thinking or talking or hands moving that are actually as biological as the heart pumping. But there's something a little different about those impulses. They feel like those things I am doing. So there's a slightly different quality to the experience of them. But if awareness lands on that and investigates it a little bit more deeply than we normally would, we could actually come to the conclusion that, wow, these things that I believed were my doing, they feel like my doing, are as impersonal as the heart pumping. That I had a thought that came out of nowhere, that suggests that I do such and such. And it seemed like a good idea. It felt like a good idea, and so the action followed. And if this is seen time and time again, and seen to be the driver of our movement through life, and what I mean by seen is just really observing it for ourselves in daily living. The thought might come first, I wonder if this is true, that there's an impulse that drives me each moment. And the impulse can be a feeling of, like a biological feeling, or it could be a thought, or it could be an emotion. And as we start seeing time and time again that I'm ordering food because this feeling of hunger has arisen, and I didn't control when it was going to arise, then a simple investigation like that can be enough to undo this strong belief in personal doership that has been put in place because the experience suggests that that's the case. And it's been put in place and reinforced for our whole life to the extent that it's not seen as a belief. And a simple investigation that we do regularly enough, so just seeing something once, if awareness lands on this, there's an impulse for hunger. Yes, I see there's an impulse for hunger and it drives me towards food. But if we just do it once, it's probably not going to dissolve the ingrained belief of personal doership. But we don't have to do it for 40 years to undo a belief that has taken 40 years to be put in place. Maybe just doing it for 3 weeks and really coming to see every time that the body moves, it's because there's an impulse. And that impulse is based on not my initiation. What this seeing would mean is that we would come to see that the other in life moves based on a whole set of instructions that are not their doing. This radically changes. This is a very basic investigation, really, and it radically changes the idea of who I am and the idea of who the other is. And so, if it's true that what we're looking for is happiness in daily living, and we conclude that daily living is actually interhuman relationship, by and large, that's what life is, interhuman relationship. So if we're looking for happiness in this life, it means we're looking for happiness in interhuman relationship. And we find that our unhappiness in interhuman relationship is the resistance we have to what the other has done and how the other acts. Basically a judgment towards the other. And we'll also find that the uncomfortableness in interhuman relationship extends to ourself, a judgment of what we have done, a judgment of what we have done as either appropriate or inappropriate, right or wrong. And so from there we have this load of guilt and blame. Guilt towards ourselves for those actions that happen through us that deliver pain to ourselves or to others. And blame towards the other for those things that they have done that delivers pain to me or someone I love. Effectively, that's our relationship to life, a relationship of competition, of suspicion, of being fearful of what the other can do to me in any moment. And then also being fearful about what I might do that upsets society, or even worse, what I might do that upsets God. So we could also have a fear of God. But And this, when we feel it for ourselves, is our unhappiness in life, this resistance that stems from having an idea of ourselves as a separate, independent entity, not connected to anything else, having to navigate its way through life, having to control life, having to try and control the others. This is a lot of hard work. So if it's not true, if this is not what we really are, if this is not what life really is, then it makes sense that it's worthwhile to see it. Not because someone is imposing this on us, so these pointers are not an imposition on someone that says you have to do this or that. It's actually just a suggestion to see life as it is. And I'm not even saying this is how life is. These are pointers, and you can choose to adopt them and investigate them, verify them for yourself. And whether we adopt them or not turns out to be not so much in our control. But rather we find ourselves in a situation where life, through, in this case, me, let's say, is delivering certain new conditioning. And I'm not in control of what I'm saying. What I'm saying is driven by an impulse in each moment. I didn't sit down and plan what I say. And even if I did sit down and plan what I say, there would have been an impulse at the time to sit down and plan what I say. Which means that planning and what I say is not so much my doing. So we can look at this being the unfolding of life in such a way that life is now providing new conditioning. And life's always been providing conditioning. Every single moment, life is conditioning the body, which in a sense starts off as a biological entity based on its genetic structure. And that genetic structure is not something we controlled. And then life impacts that genetic structure moment after moment to make the human being exactly the way they are. So in each moment, the human being is one way, the way they happen to be in that moment. And so the impulse that arises is an impulse based on something from outside, like an impulse that comes from outside, or we can look at it as an impulse that is generated based on my makeup in that moment. And so if we start to see ourselves and the other like this, then the judgment that tends to happen so automatically, which is also not our doing, a judgment based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, then that judgment will start to fall away, because the basis of the judgment that the other person should be different, that basis is now changing because life is providing new up-to-date conditioning. Up-to-date conditioning that hopefully leads to an investigation for ourselves, which once again is a happening based on our up-to-date conditioning, and that will affect the beliefs that are in place. So it's fair to say that up to a certain point, life has put conditioning in place that suggests I am the doer and the other is the doer, and therefore when life unfolds a certain way, we have to blame the other, we have to feel guilt, we have to feel pride. Pride for those actions that happen through me that are positive, guilt for those actions that happen through me that are negative, and blame towards the other for those actions that happen through the other that deliver pain to myself or someone I love. It's not optional. Life has put in place the belief I am the doer, so that response has to arise. And when we look at it, we find out that that's actually my unhappiness. My unhappiness is this feeling of uncomfortableness towards life and towards the other. So if what we're looking for is happiness, and it turns out that happiness is just the absence of suffering, not the addition of anything, but the falling away of this uncomfortableness, then it makes sense that if we come to understand the basis on which the uncomfortableness arises, understand that uncomfortableness arises on the basis that I am the doer and the other is the doer. Not much more complex than that. Then it's that realization and not some other realization, which means if we have a lot of other information but not this information, then that other information may not bring about, in fact it is unlikely to bring about the required changes. Because what we're really seeking for is this happiness. So it makes sense that we need this information. If this information is the basis of our unhappiness, and happiness turns out to be the absence of our unhappiness, then this information is crucial. Actually, not much else is important. And the belief I am the doer and the other is the doer, something life has put in place. And if we find ourselves in this situation, which when we investigate it is not so much my doing, it feels like I chose to come here. But when we look at how we chose to come here, it's because someone mentioned that the talks are on, or we saw a poster or something on Facebook, and an impulse arose, oh yes, I'll come along to that. And then when we say we'll go along to that, we're not in control of the outcome. The talk might not be on, or the talk is on, but you don't know what's going to be said. You might resonate with what's being said, or you might think this is absolute nonsense. And that response, which we feel is my response, is once again an impulse that arises based on what is said, which we're not in control of, and who I am in this moment, that when I investigate it, I find out is much less my control than I think. So what this tends to do is start to inspire an attitude of witnessing, an attitude of noticing what happens in life, witnessing feelings arise in the body, emotions arise in the body, actions arise in the body, witness the actions of the other, witness our response to the actions of the other. This is a way of relating to life which can be completely the opposite to what is normally the case. When we believe we're the doer, then these feelings that arise, which we consider my feelings, the very nature that they're felt to be mine means complete involvement in them, which means the very opposite of witnessing. So the suggestion in this teaching is that everything in life, from the beginning of time to the end of time, is a spontaneous creation of Source. That Source has turned into the manifestation. That all of us are part of the manifestation, and everything that is happening in life is part of this very creative story of life. And so that the introduction of that notion, if it resonates with us, can lead to a shift of being completely involved in what is happening in life to starting to a watching it, a witnessing it. Witnessing it as a happening, not my doing. And as that witnessing happens, then we can find ourselves more connected to self, the self which is a formless awareness, a sense of being, and a connection to that self tends to deliver a sweet relaxation. And the more often that sweet relaxation is felt simply by dropping into being and witnessing life unfold, the more self-evident it becomes that, wow, my happiness, my contentment, my peace is to be delivered from completely the opposite of what I used to believe it would be delivered through. The belief was that my happiness is to be delivered through achievement, through getting somewhere. And so that movement of trying to get somewhere and trying to control life would be the prevailing way of relating to life. And as we start to witness life more and more, then this connection to self, which delivers a contentment without us even needing, before we need to do anything, that becomes the evidence that starts to show us, wow, our thinking is completely upside down. And so this is why in a lot of teachings it's suggested actually there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to achieve, that what you're looking for is right here, it's always been here, and that for as long as you think that it's out there, then it means that there is a false belief of who we are and what the purpose of life is and where our contentment and happiness is to be found. So if anyone's feeling uncomfortable at this stage because they think that maybe this is a whole set of beliefs and someone's imposing their view on me, and actually when we listen to what's really being said, this is saying in each moment, act, do exactly what you think or feel you should do. Complete freedom. It's saying that what you think or feel to do is exactly what you're meant to be thinking, feeling and doing. So no judgment for that. This is actually the opposite of what we're so used to hearing from someone putting forward their opinion or what seems like their beliefs in life. Usually in life someone puts forward their opinion and it's telling you how to act. Usually telling you how to act in order for you to behave a way in which the other person would like. And we tend to rebel against someone trying to control us. And so sometimes the content of what's being here can be misunderstood, and all we hear is someone putting forward their opinion. And straight away the internal reaction is of resistance. If we really hear what's being said, it's saying everyone is completely free to be exactly the way they are. And that it's only a false idea of oneself and the other that will create a judgment and a hatred towards the other for being a certain way. So rather than me sit here and just talk, does anyone have any comment or question or things they'd like clarified?
Wouldn't you be repressing your emotions if you were to live with those concepts? If I'm to blame anyone right now or in any moment, and then this concept arises, and then I repress, okay, not to blame, he is not the doer, don't I be repressing?
Sure. So the question is, if I feel blame arising, and as I feel blame arising, the thought arises, I shouldn't feel blame because I'm not the doer and they're not the doer. Isn't that a repressing of what is naturally arising? And my answer is it will be if that's taken on as a belief of how I should act. So if this is taken on as a belief that says, I shouldn't blame the other, I shouldn't feel guilty, then what will happen is we'll try to control our way of being in life according to these sets of shoulds and shouldn'ts, which is basically the old way that we've lived life, because we believe that our happiness is to be found in outcomes. And then on the other hand, if the understanding that I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer starts to settle in much deeper than just a belief, because as the concepts are ingrained in us, we find that there is a observation and investigation for ourself in daily living that starts to observe certain ways of us, our functioning, and really starts to see, wow, my attitude towards that topic is completely based on my up-to-date conditioning, let's say. That I find myself growing up in a family that believes in a certain political stance, and I find myself reacting to another political stance, and I come to see, wow, my political stance is based on my up-to-date conditioning, which includes my family background, for example. And so as we start to tick the concepts off for ourselves, then the understanding becomes much more than just a belief, but it becomes something that we've verified for ourselves. And so what can happen is when blame arises, awareness lands on the fact that blame arises. And rather than a belief that says I shouldn't blame, instead of a belief coming up, which is the first example, if the belief comes up, then we judge ourselves for blaming. And that becomes blame plus guilt for blaming. So an extra load of suffering on top of the blame. But if the understanding has gone deep because of our own investigation, then what will come up is the understanding I'm not the doer and the other isn't the doer, which can cut off our blame for the other. But now it's being cut off not because I shouldn't blame, but rather because the deep understanding is arising and saying, actually, this is not the basis on which life functions. Doership is not the basis on which life functions. And so it's not a belief that says I shouldn't blame. So I hope that answers the question. It's a great question, because this subtlety is what often happens in spiritual teachings, is people take the concepts that are just pointers. So the concept that says peace of mind, regardless of circumstance, is available. That's a concept, it's a pointer. But it's not saying that you have to make that happen. It's just describing what's available. But the sense of personal doership that is attached to outcomes hears that and says, okay, I'm going to make this happen. And that's when it tends to become a belief. And when the concepts become a belief, they don't have the power of that they do when they act as pointers that allow us to see what is being pointed at.
Roger, I may not be very clear in my question, but I want to run through a series of events that happens inside of me and want to look at it with the light of what you said. So it is seen that things or thoughts or whatever I do mostly comes as impulse. Sometimes it's very clear. There are impulses that just comes and goes. There are impulses that comes with action energy, and even before you realize you have done something, acted in a certain way. But then there are also times when an impulse comes with, and with equal force, a contradictory thought comes to that. And that seems like a conflict inside of me. And then it seems like I have to choose. And a choice is made. But there is a lot of association that, as if, there was a lot of thinking about it, so the same thoughts repeats itself in cycles, and then you pick one up, and it seems like I picked one up, and sometimes it appears that it's very against the real desire that I have, and it appears that I'm acting against my own desires, to the point of sometimes even as if I'm acting against my own freedom. And then there is that feeling or another impulse of blame or guilt that comes with it, that I'm acting against my own freedom. If I just look at it all in the light of the fact that everything is predestined, and this is also understood to a great extent, but in such moments it's difficult to accept that it's all predestined and that I can let go of the responsibility of even be responsible for being responsible for my freedom. I don't know if you understand.
Yeah, so I'll comment on different sections. The first part is that because we've believed that our happiness is to be found in outcomes, the idea that my happiness is simply available because of who I am is not something that we have much experience of. So society and our experience tells us that the best that is available is pleasure in the moment. And so that becomes our idea of what my happiness is, pleasure in the moment. And so from there, society and ourselves set up a whole lot of rules and strategies of how life is going to be most pleasurable. And those are a whole lot of rules of shoulds and shouldn'ts. And the deepest pleasure that we're looking for is what we spoke about yesterday, the pleasure of love. So deep down we're convinced that my happiness will come through love. Love from the other and love of the other. And so when we look at what's happened is there's a whole lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts that have been put in place based on this idea that my happiness will be found from love from the other and by loving the other. And so the shoulds and shouldn'ts are basically our way of telling us how to act in life in order to get the love we're looking for. And at some point we might register that these shoulds and shouldn'ts are effectively forcing us in each moment to live life according to a set of rules. And it's living life according to these rules that society have put in place or that we have put in place that curtails our freedom, that is an infringement on our freedom, on our true nature. So our true nature is happy to function in each moment, to flow without following rules. And when this is heard by the brain, someone would say, well, this is going to be a very selfish and chaotic way of living life. If you follow no rules, then everyone's going to, it'd be one each for themselves. That assumption is coming from this belief in personal doership that is completely obsessed with getting more and more for itself, believing that that's its happiness. Actually, we find that as we stop believing in the shoulds and shouldn'ts, what's dissolving is this belief in personal doership, this belief that I need certain outcomes in order to be complete. So as we let go of shoulds and shouldn'ts, what's falling away is what traditionally is referred to as the ego. And it's the ego that tends to cause most problems in life. It's the ego that is attacking the other. It's the ego that is greedy and claiming more and more. It's the ego that's in competition. So as we really surrender and say, I'm not going to follow these shoulds and shouldn'ts anymore, what we find is that our movement in life turns out to be completely different to what the brain imagines would be the case. The brain says this will be a chaotic existence if we don't follow any rules. And instead we connect to a part of ourself that is intelligent, naturally intelligent, far more understanding about what it needs in life. And furthermore, a part of us that is altruistic, that doesn't want to see our happiness at the cost of the other, but understands that we can be happy at the same time as the other being happy. Because our happiness now is known to be something that is internal and not a happiness that requires us taking, which means taking at the cost of the other. So when we drop the shoulds and shouldn'ts, we find this great freedom, and the freedom actually is the freedom to be who we really are, to connect to a part of inside of us that is giving us instruction in each moment as to how to move in flow with life. So what you're suggesting is that by following these shoulds or shouldn'ts, there is a conflict between the head and the heart, let's say. And when there's a conflict between the head and the heart, that conflict arises as an uncomfortableness with oneself. So in my personal experience, when I realized this, it came down to something very simple, is that I'd come home from work, having worked a day at work, and I'd lie on the couch, which I really used to love doing, and it would feel great, because I was tired, and the perfect thing to do when you're tired is to lie on the couch, not have to do anything. Then I'd realize that I've got a dinner date, let's say, and the time is 5 minutes to 7, and I've got to be at the restaurant at 7:30, which really means at most I have 5 more minutes to lie on the couch. And if I go to my feeling, actually I'd like to lie on the couch for the next hour and a half. And so what would happen is 5 minutes would go past, and I'd really feel, I don't feel like getting off the couch, so I'd give myself an extra 5 minutes and say, well, if I'm 5 minutes late, then that's okay. And then that 5 minutes is over, and it's like, I don't feel like, but I'd push myself because I should, I said I would go out for dinner, so I have to honor my commitment. And so at some point I realized that this isn't what I want. And the awareness that this internal conflict was actually disturbing my happiness in the moment, it was my unhappiness in the moment, then led me to realize that I'm free in this moment to go or not go to dinner. And so when I put this peace as my priority and became clear, actually all I want is the end of internal conflict, then with that as my priority, the consequences to things became secondary, which meant previously I couldn't cancel the dinner because I was afraid of what my friend would think. So what was priority to me was what other people thought about me or what I thought about myself. But once the priority changed from being what someone else thought about me or what I thought about myself to internal peace, then I had to adjust my priority, and that meant the consequences of cancelling became secondary. So I understood that if I cancelled 25 minutes before I meant to be at dinner, there could be a consequence to that action. My friend might say, look, you're unreliable and I don't want to be friends with someone unreliable. And at some point I had to accept, okay, that's a consequence, but I'm not going to be afraid of that consequence for the rest of my life, otherwise it's going to get in the way of my ultimate goal, which I've now recognized to be internal peace. So at some point I became brave and said, this is what I have to do. And I'd send a message off saying, look, I'm really sorry, but I can't make it to dinner tonight. And what I found was something that I didn't expect. A message would come back and go, oh, this is really great news. I'm really tired also. Why don't we meet some other time? And so often what we think is going to be a negative outcome doesn't necessarily turn out to be as negative as we thought. And because each time I made plans, I found that at the time of the plan, I couldn't be sure whether I would want to do it or not. I came to realize that it's best actually to not make plans rather than to make plans and then have to keep cancelling. And so that was my next strategy that came in place, is to not make plans for a point in time in the future that I'm not sure what I will want to do at that time. And that took a bit of, bravery, in the sense of thinking, well, how am I going to socialize with people if I can't adhere to social standards? But then once again I said, well, are you going to prioritize that, or are you going to prioritize your internal peace? So once that internal peace became the priority, then there is the reasoning and the bravery to start challenging all the shoulds and shouldn'ts that we've assumed to be truth. And at some point in time, after maybe 3 months of not being able to make any commitments, days in advance, I found a different feeling start to arise, which was someone would ask whether I'd like to go to the cinema in a week's time. And now a feeling would come up. Instead of the feeling coming up as, well, I don't know. I can't say yes or no, so I'll have to say no. A feeling would come up and go, yes, that sounds nice. And I thought, well, this is strange, because I've learnt not to follow that planning a week in advance. But something said, no, this is different. Now you have a feeling that says yes to that. So when the feeling started to say yes, I'd say yes. I'd think we'll go to the movies in a week's time. And then what I found was that in a week's time, I'd feel like going to the movies, as opposed to what was happening previously, where I would make plans, and then often at the time of the plan, I wouldn't feel like doing what the plan was. And the difference was that I had now shifted from shoulds and shouldn'ts to feeling what to do in each moment. The initial shift was from doing the shoulds and shouldn'ts into feeling the biological feeling in the body, the hunger. So that means eating when I'm hungry, not when it's lunchtime. Saying, well, going to sleep when I'm tired, and not doing something else just because I'd arranged to do it. And in shifting into this feeling perspective, what I noticed is that there was a completely different set of instructions functioning. The instruction in each moment was an instruction that was coming from outside. What that meant is that coming from an impulse that I was feeling in the body that I didn't create, and that shifting from the shoulds and shouldn'ts meant that the feeling was a combination of a number of factors, a feeling of the biological impulse, but also a feeling of intuition, a feeling of intellect also, where the brain would assess a situation and say, look, these are the upsides and the downsides, but not make a decision. The brain wouldn't make a decision and say, you should do this or that. But another part of the brain, the working mind, would assess the situation and just deliver data into the system. And then I found that what I felt like doing was a final product of a whole lot of faculties in the body. Feeling, biological feeling, intuition, and also intellect. And that feeling would guide me quite truly, I found. It didn't mean that the outcome was going to be perfect all the time. It didn't mean that now I was infallible in life. Still, from that place of feeling, I would make decisions that didn't turn out to be perfect, but at least I had found this place of authenticity. Authenticity relative to the old way of making decisions, which was based on shoulds and shouldn'ts, which effectively blocked out a whole lot of intelligent faculties of the body. And so from that point, I decided that that feeling was my instruction from God, and that all I needed to do in each moment was follow the instruction that I was given. And then I started to live life consistently that way, and I understood why I was doing that, because it seemed, based on my analysis up to that point in time, the only analysis I was capable of doing, that that was the best of the two options. And so in each moment I can consistently live that way, knowing that the outcome is not in my control. Sometimes I'll get what I want and sometimes I won't. But now without regret, because there's the understanding that this has turned out to be, out of an assessment, the best way of living life consistently. So no regret in the past and no expectations in the future. My job is simply to do in each moment what I think or feel I should do, knowing that ultimately the outcome not in my control, that life is unfolding, and it's unfolding through me functioning this way. It's also unfolding through me functioning through the shoulds and shouldn'ts. It's the same unfolding of life. One way creates an internal resistance, and the other creates a sense of being in flow and oneness with life. So my suggestion is, when you have this conflict inside, to try and see if there is a component of the conflict, or one side of the conflict is based on a whole lot of shoulds and shouldn'ts, how you should and shouldn't act. And then ask yourself, why is that should and shouldn't in place? And you'll find that it's based on your parents' idea of how you should live life, society's idea of how you should live life, your idea of how you should life based on an attachment to outcomes, meaning prioritizing outcomes. And then you might say, well, actually, I'm not sure that my idea of my happiness is that accurate. I'm definitely not sure that my parents' idea of how to live life is that accurate. And I'm not at all sure that society's idea of how to live life is that accurate. So with that understanding, we really question these shoulds and shouldn'ts. And then they fall away.
Yeah, this was very helpful. The the times when I find the most difficulty accepting it's supposed to be this way is when, for example, in the example that you gave of lying on the couch versus going on a date, when instead of the date it's a satsang, and I know that I want to be in the satsang and that it makes me, that's where I really would like to be. But in that moment, either lying on the couch feels so much better suddenly, or the calculation of pros and cons that the mind presents of having to go to the satsang and the the logistics behind it, if it's in a different city, or all of those, and I choose that, and then there's this, because I would want to be in the satsang, but I give into the.
So why do you want to be in satsang?
because that's the place that I feel very harmonious.
But in that moment, you don't. In that moment,
or the calculations that my mind gives, the information of pros and cons, that's wins many a times.
yeah. So I would suggest that when you answer the question, that's where I feel I'll be most harmonious in satsang, is potentially a belief, and that what satsang is saying is in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel you should do. And that's not an instruction, that's basically a description of how everyone is always acting in life, doing what they think they should do or what they feel to do. And the description here is that if we do what we think we should do, we tend to be disconnected from ourself, disconnected from the body, and functioning from a set of shoulds and shouldn'ts, which in itself is not wrong. It's life unfolding that way. It's just a description that if we continually live from our shoulds and shouldn'ts, we tend to feel disconnected and uncomfortable. And satsang is saying that if we tend to follow what we feel like doing, our experience is that we'll feel much more connected and much more at peace, that this internal conflict will fall away. So next time you have this conflict about lying on the couch or going to satsang, you might remember that what satsang is suggesting is in each moment, ideally, do what you feel to do without judging it as appropriate or inappropriate. And just use that as an experiment for yourself to then see what the outcome is, to see what your experience is. And if by doing what you feel to do, you find your experience is very uncomfortable, then try something different. But if you find that for the first time you let into your feeling to lie on the couch without any guilt, and you're surprised, wow, this feels surprisingly good. You realize that you have the freedom to choose in each moment, that you really have two options: to go to satsang when you don't feel like it, or to remain lying on the couch. That becomes one of our real freedoms, is to see I have options. So even if a burglar came in the door and held a gun to my head and said, take me upstairs where the money is, my realization is, in this moment, I have two options. The fact that someone is holding a gun to my head doesn't take away the fact that I can say yes or no. I have those options. And from understanding I have those options, I then will say yes or no. I might say yes because someone is holding a gun to my head. Right? But before saying yes, I'm clear that I have the option to say yes or no. Circumstance may mean I choose to say yes. But I'll say yes, let's say, knowing that the outcome's not in my control. So if I say yes and I go upstairs, the burglar might take the money and then shoot me. Or I say yes, they go upstairs, they take the money and they don't harm me. Which of the two happens not in my control? No matter how sure I am that one or the other is going to happen. Or I could say no, and the burglar gets angry and shoots me. Or I say no, and the burglar freaks out, says this is not what I expected, and runs out the door. Still not in my control, but the point here is to realize that in life, in each moment, you have options. And when we're living from shoulds and shouldn'ts, what happens is we effectively lose sight of a whole range of options that we have. And so we don't feel free. So, long and the short of it is, try doing what you feel to do and see what it delivers. The freedom that comes from that understanding to do what you feel like doing means that satsang has worked, and that there is a far deeper degree of wisdom in place than for someone who keeps going to satsang. Says, I've had years of satsang, so I must be very wise, and yet they're still following a whole list of shoulds and shouldn'ts. So all it takes is a deep realization of something, transcending a set of beliefs. That's all that this spiritual seeking is about, is getting us to change radically, and the change is effectively the dissolving of a whole lot of beliefs of who I am and how I should act, how the other should act, how life should look. We have this picture of, in each moment we wake up at the beginning of the day and we have this mental picture of how life should look. And life is like an avalanche sort of coming down the mountain. It's this wild beast that is already in motion. And our picture that we wake up with is sort of like telling the avalanche to move a little bit to the left, please, and a little bit to the right. It doesn't work like that. So at some point when we realize, well, maybe I should just drop my picture. And if I drop my picture of life, which when I have a picture of life, how life actually is tends to create a reaction to my picture. My picture becomes me, and then life impacts it. So the more or the less concrete I am, meaning the less concrete my idea is of how life should be, then the less there is for life to impact, which then means we find ourselves sort of flowing, yet fluidly, with life.
Yeah, but sometimes I feel that those shoulds and shouldn'ts can get confused for feelings. Like when they're so ingrained that they're part of our up-to-date conditioning, then it's really confusing to know if what I'm feeling is really what I'm feeling, or is something that has been conditioned in me to show up as a feeling. So even in that example of the couch, maybe the reason why I feel like staying on the couch is because my body's too tired to go to dinner, right? So in that moment, what feels good is just to let my body rest. But that's actually just on the surface of it. And if I kind of transcend that and actually go to dinner with a really good friend, then after dinner, I'd be like, wow, I'm really happy that I actually did that and didn't just stay with that superficial feeling of, like staying here.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's not only circumstances, but also up-to-date conditioning that could be confused as feelings sometimes, and it's really hard to tell them apart.
Yeah, it is. And so sometimes this suggestion to do what you feel like for some people is actually not appropriate, and what they need is much more, this is how you should act, because what they feel like could be based on a whole lot of addiction and deeply ingrained false ideas of who they are. And so if someone feels like killing someone, there's a clarification here. Don't do it, because Roger said do what you feel like. Go and see a therapist and see if you can get to the bottom of why you feel like killing someone. But if the feeling is about lying on the couch versus going out to dinner, then there are some risks that we can take, and whichever it is, we can experiment with it, with first just lying on the couch and seeing what that delivers to us. And if it delivers peace of mind, then it's a sign that it's coming from a natural impulse. And that can become our beacon, is whether there is peace of mind or whether it's suffering. And so if we continually investigate, understanding that suffering comes because we're judging ourselves or the other, then when suffering arises, we'll look at the situation and see if actually what I thought was my feeling was actually another set of shoulds and shouldn'ts manifesting as a true feeling. And so this experimenting of doing what you feel like, understanding that it's not suddenly a magical solution to getting everything right, but it's a way of dropping out of one set of shoulds and shouldn'ts. We might drop out of one set of shoulds and shouldn'ts and find ourselves into another set of shoulds and shouldn'ts in our feelings that are presenting as authentic feeling, but then we find it's another set of beliefs. And then from there we can investigate that, because it means that we'll still be feeling an uncomfortableness functioning from there, if they are another set of shoulds and shouldn'ts that are presenting as feeling. And so then the investigation goes deeper and says, there must be something, some deeper place where I can function from, because it's apparent that these new feelings are actually more conditions, more shoulds and shouldn'ts. So this is a suggestion to do something differently, but then to keep investigating and seeing if freedom comes. And if it doesn't, then to do something different again, until such time as we find a click where a freedom does come in. But if we drop into feeling and we find that there's suffering for lying on the couch, but we find that the suffering is guilt that says, I shouldn't be lying on the couch, then that doesn't mean that it's wrong to lie on the couch and that we should do something different. What our awareness will hopefully land on is the fact that I've chosen to lie on the couch instead of go out for dinner, and my shoulds and shouldn'ts are staying with me on the couch. The shoulds and shouldn'ts are saying, you shouldn't just be lying on the couch. What sort of productive life is this? And then awareness landing on that will, there'll be an intelligence that starts to basically identify all these components in life that we weren't particularly interested in seeing before. Is that convincing or not quite? Today, in the Facebook post that I put up each day, I wrote something like, is your desire for peace of mind getting in the way of your peace of mind? Which indicates one of the main principles of suffering. And the main principle of suffering is when what we've been talking about here is our idea of how life should be. And even the idea that the idea of peace of mind, the concept of peace of mind, can be turned into an insistence of how life is. And what happens is that that insistence of life being a certain way will look at the present moment and judge it as appropriate or inappropriate. And if the idea for peace of mind, the notion of peace of mind, sees suffering in the moment, it's going to say, well, this is inappropriate. This suffering, which is the opposite of peace of mind, is inappropriate. And that commentary on the present moment that it's inappropriate is actually more suffering. So at some point we can find that, wow, this idea for liberation has turned into a judgment of life. And that dropping that idea and just allowing life to be as it is, meaning accepting even suffering that's there, can deliver a whole new level of peace. Just dropping the idea that my life has to look any way in particular.
Two questions. One, if
Can you just hold and just,
if you were to be in a relationship, will you be with her without expecting anything of her? And I think that you don't always have an option in every moment. As an extreme example, a prisoner doesn't have an option to get out of the prison. As an extreme example.
So the the concepts that are presented here are suggesting that if you find yourself in prison, which is something that might happen, that this freedom is completely available in prison. The reason being is that the freedom spoken about here is not a freedom of circumstance, but rather a freedom of our attitude to the circumstance. So it says that our peace of mind is not based on circumstance, not based on pleasure or pain, but our attitude to the flow of life. And so if we've got an attitude that says my happiness is based on circumstance, if we find ourselves in prison, then we're going to spend our whole time resisting the fact we're in prison, because there'll be a belief that says my happiness is dependent on me not being in prison. So it's good to use an extreme example, is that if we can accept that being in prison must be my destiny as part of the story of life, that I was forced based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning to have acted the way I acted, which delivered an outcome that was deemed to be outside of the law, and as a result the consequence was to go to prison. Now we look at it and we say that's not ideal, clearly. I'm not excusing myself. I accept that the consequence is there's still going to be a consequence to action. But if we recognize that series of actions that led to this consequence effectively were inevitable part of the story of life, and when I look at it based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I had no control over, then the first part is to accept that the past happened and here I am in prison. If the understanding along those lines is deep enough, we'll understand that in each moment, whatever happens in prison is part of destiny unfolding, that the flow of life itself is only ever pleasure or pain. So in prison, there's bound to be much more pain than there is pleasure in the outside world. Nonetheless, it's understood that pleasure or pain are exactly that. They're pleasurable or painful, but not a determining factor of who I really am at my core, not a determining factor of my true happiness. And if this is understood, what we'll find is that the attachment to pleasure or pain has fallen away, because attachment to pleasure or pain is the belief that says my happiness is dependent on pleasure and the absence of pain. And when that's in place, we are resisting pain and craving after pleasure. So when that belief has fallen away, we find our attachment has fallen away, which means that we tend to not resist the flow of life as much, but rather accept it, means enjoying the pleasure when it's available and enduring the pain when it is delivered, without blaming the other as if they are the doer, without blaming ourselves as if we are the doer. And that attitude to the flow of life is available in prison, which means that the pleasure or pain will be there, but a connection to ourself, our connection to ourself as the formless awareness that functions through everyone, will be there. And it's from that connection and recognizing our formless essence, the essence of the human being, that's available in each moment. And when we drop in there, we find that it's always complete, it's always self-contenting, meaning it's always at peace, and that it always was there and always will be there. And so it's from a connection to that place that peace, even when we're in prison, can happen. And so we've heard of accounts of people in atrocious situations in life, in wars, in concentration camps, that have had these epiphanies, these insights, in the most terrible of circumstances, and they've realized that the essence of who they are is untouched by circumstance. And with that realization, there can be a peace, not necessarily meaning that the circumstance is any less unfortunate, but now finding that who they are is not determined by the circumstance. And then they come out of that circumstance without a hatred and without a load of guilt and blame for those people that seem to be the perpetrators of their freedom. And so Nelson Mandela was quoted as saying that when he left prison, as he walked out of the gate, he realized that if he held on to hatred for those people that imprisoned him, that he still wouldn't be free. So his realization as he left the prison gates was that I have to let go of any hatred towards those that have imprisoned me, which really means an understanding of the situation as it really is, that those that imprisoned him were doing what they were destined to do. And this is the realization that was expressed through Jesus on the cross. Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they are doing, which really is another way of saying that they are forced to act this way, not knowing their true nature, that they can't act any other way, they don't know any other way. And so forgive them, meaning I don't blame them. So I have already forgiven them, meaning that there is nothing to forgive. Actually, seeing that there is no one to forgive, that life is unfolding as it's destined to unfold. So, I forget what the first part. Yeah. Okay. So, once again, for the benefit of the recording, if we find ourselves in relationship with this understanding, will we expect anything of the other? And the answer is depending on what the definition of expectation is. Usually expectation, which is one of the forms of suffering, guilt, blame, pride, all based on the belief in personal doership. And the other half of suffering is worry and anxiety, and expectation and attachment to outcomes. And as a form of suffering, expectation means the ingrained belief that says I need the other to be a certain way in order for me to be complete, or I need life to unfold a certain way in order for me to be complete. So with this understanding of who we really are, the expectation of life being a certain way has fallen away, which means the expectation that someone acts a certain way has fallen away. However, we're still left with the biological makeup of the body. The biological makeup of the body has its preferences, part of its genes and up-to-date conditioning. And so when we enter into a relationship, we're entering into a relationship because it's in line with, hopefully, in line with our biological preferences, which means that biologically we have a preference to how the other acts in each moment. And if the other is continually acting outside of our preference, at some point there could be a decision that says, I think our relationship status needs to change, because the way you are, without this being a judgment, without it blaming you, which I understand that the way you are is the way you have to be, just like the way I am is the way I have to be. And my preferences are not something I'm dictating, but something that's part of my makeup. So I'm not saying that you are wrong in being the way that you are, but the way you are is delivering outcomes that are not in line with my preferences. And just like I can't change my preferences radically, I can't expect you to change radically. And so the assessment is that probably we're better off separate, not in relationship. That being said, that's not an expectation. That's simply observing the situation as it is, based on one's biological preferences and based on how the other is designed to function. And so when that assessment is made, the decision to end the relationship is one that can happen without resentment, without blame, without guilt, and you can separate as friends, assuming that neither party is heavily attached to outcomes. Because if the partner is heavily attached to outcomes, meaning that they insist that the relationship remains in place, this suggestion that I'm putting forward will be an attack on who they think they are, and the question of whether we can part as friends is then questionable, because they might say, you hurt me, I hate you. I hate you and I never want to speak to you again. So there will be a hope, let's say, for someone to act and be a certain way without that being an insistence that the other person is the way we want them to be. Once again, it's also important, this is not something that, these are descriptions of how we can find ourselves functioning in life. The descriptions are not intended to be taken on as a set of shoulds and shouldn'ts, exactly as your earlier question pointed out. Because if they get taken on as a set of shoulds and shouldn'ts and say, I shouldn't have expectations of my partner, and then when we find that we do have expectations and resistance happens, then if these descriptions have been turned into shoulds and shouldn'ts, we'll judge ourselves as being inappropriate for having expectations. And that's not the point. The the suggestion here is if we have expectations, then that's because life has designed us in that moment to be exactly like that, not our doing. Not our doing that we have these expectations. So hopefully the understanding has penetrated deeply enough that even if the expectations are there, and we see that someone else's behavior is creating suffering inside of us because we have expectations, hopefully the understanding is deep enough to say, the suffering is there because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. Something I wasn't in control of, something I can't change in this moment, and therefore I'm just going to allow the suffering to be there without judging it. If that happens, then we can be pleased in seeing that there is primary suffering, the suffering of the expectation, but then no secondary suffering coming from blaming ourselves or feeling guilty. And then we can feel pleased about the fact that life has changed our up-to-date conditioning such that we can observe that suffering, that expectation, as not my doing. Because once life has brought that into place, then what will probably happen is the understanding will go deeper and deeper, such that it eventually uproots the basis on which the expectation is there. And so at some point in the future, we'll find that the other acts a certain way, not in line with our preferences, and there's no judgment of that. Still a biological reaction that says, hey, what you're doing is not very nice, but without deep blame for the other, without resentment for what the other is doing. So I read a quote, actually I'll read it here because it's very nice. This was a message someone sent me today about Henry Ford, the inventor of the motor car. And it's very much in line with something I had heard recently about Einstein. And that is that during an interview with the Detroit Times, Henry Ford revealed that the source of his inspiration and the work he had done was somewhat mysterious. He dedicated his brilliance to a master mind. He further stated that Somewhere is a master mind sending brainwave messages to us. There is a great spirit. I never did anything by my own volition. I was pushed by invisible forces within and without me. So these messages are repeated over and over from people who have done great things in history. And there's a realization in these people who are open to allowing life to flow, which really means that the shoulds and shouldn'ts and seeing life in a constrained way, seeing themselves as a separate independent entity, once that's fallen away, a flow of consciousness happens, which is always happening, but it becomes felt. And then there's a realization, and people are happy to admit this. This is not my doing. That these great ideas that I had, they actually just spontaneously arose inside of me. I couldn't have come up with it on my own. And so Einstein said something very similar about when he discovered the formula E=mc², one of the most significant discoveries of our time in physics that have led to so many, the basis of which has been the basis of so many advancements in physics and technology and modern inventions. And Einstein says that the equation came to me from outside, meaning it was just dropped into his consciousness with all of the scientific knowledge and wisdom contained in it. He just happened to be a vehicle that could appreciate what was being dropped in. So his up-to-date conditioning could understand if that came into my being, I'd wonder, well, what does that really mean? He was just designed to be able to appreciate this formula that had been delivered to him. And as a 4-year-old, Einstein was given a compass by his father. And he said he was fascinated looking at the needle of the compass turning on its own. And he made the statement something along the lines that at that time he became convinced that there was a greater force controlling everything. So a 4-year-old looking at this needle of a compass moving and realizing that he wasn't moving it, and that the compass itself doesn't have an intelligence that could be the mover of the compass. And so he concluded there must be a greater force moving everything. And this is the realization that we can have. The realization is that I've always believed myself to be the doer, the instigator of everything that happens in life. And it's this belief that is completely limiting. It's this belief that covers up my connection to Source. That once this belief falls away, and I realize that whatever is happening through me is a movement of Source, what simultaneously happens is that there's a realization that what I am is actually an extension of Source. What the other is an extension of Source. I've always been this, it's just been covered up. The other is always this, and that the competition and the rivalry is something that only exists because of this false belief of who we are. That when that false belief falls away, we actually see ourselves as companions and brothers and sisters in a game of life. And then the rivalry and the competition, the comparison falls away. And what we tend to find then is this, we've dropped out of our head into our hearts, into a place of connection, of being, a place that we know as I am, the source of the sense of existence. It's the very I am that illuminates the body and creates the experience I am this. And the experience I am this in itself is not the problem. I am this, understanding that this is just an extension of that, is very different to the belief I am this as a separate, independent entity not connected to anything else. I am this as a separate independent entity means I have to fear the other, I have to fear life, and that death is the ultimate attack on who I am. Whereas the realization I am this, which is an extension of that, connected to the beingness, the formless awareness, means that there's a recognition that the body is just a vehicle through which life is experienced for a period of time, that experience of life and the Roger-ness, the Roger experience of life is exactly that, an experience that is going to be there for as long as it's destined to be there, and that once it's played its course, it will come to an end at exactly the ending point of the story, which is like a film or a book, and that the ending of the experience of Roger means death of the body, death of the vehicle, but the consciousness that is functioning through the vehicle, that consciousness simply returns to source, is never attacked by death of the vehicle. So from this perspective, resting in being, knowing that what I truly am is formless awareness. In essence, what I am is formless awareness, functioning through a particular body, which is a vehicle. That means that death of the body doesn't mean the death of who I am. And so that means that life unfolding moment to moment becomes less critical as to how it unfolds. It becomes clear that pain is not an attack on who I really am at my core. Pain is simply pain in the moment, which is why we can find ourselves in prison, and it's not going to be a pleasurable existence, but it can be a peaceful one. And why the fear of death can fall away, which means the fear of death in each moment is not there. And it turns out that our peace, our contentment, comes from recognizing what we truly are. So a shift in identity, a shift from a belief of who I am into an actual resting in being, knowing oneself directly. And that knowing of oneself is the knowing of oneself as something that ultimately is invulnerable, something that is not added to or subtracted to by the flow of life. And this is not something conceptual. This is something that actually is available in each moment, right here and right now. It requires us to understand that there is this field of being that is available in each moment, is available without us needing to do any more spiritual practice, without us needing to develop in any way. That the essence of who we are is not something that develops. And in an instant, those beliefs that prevent us from being can be transcended. The very idea that I need to work hard to become something, I need to work hard to realize everything that is being said in spiritual teachings, that's nonsense, really. I'm not criticizing. It's there because it's destiny for it to be there, but at some point we have to realize this belief pattern is nonsense. It's a false idea of who I am. It's a false idea of what is needed. And it's perpetuating the idea that my happiness is out there in the future. And all teachings are saying, actually, look within, be in the present moment, be with what is really.
You said when the body dies, there's a returning back to source of consciousness. Is it really a returning? Is it a movement, or is it always in one place?
Yeah. So it isn't really a returning. You're right. It's hard to put it into words in a sense because we're in a world of time and space. So really what it is that consciousness takes two forms, either consciousness at rest or consciousness in movement. And the human experience is the movement from consciousness at rest into consciousness in movement, which is sort of the whole life experience is a movement from consciousness at rest to consciousness in movement. And so at death, the vehicle is no longer there. And so impersonal consciousness of source no longer has a vehicle to function through. So it then returns to its resting state of consciousness in movement. So it's not actually returning anywhere, but just a shift in state. The state of being manifest back to the original state of unmanifest. So really it's like binary, switching from 0 and 1, 0 and 1. 0 is off, 1 is on. So off is unmanifest, 1 is manifest. There's nothing left, which is the original state is nothing. Then it explodes into everything, and it returns back to nothing, which is why Ramana Maharshi's ultimate concept of what life is this: he says there is no creation, there is no dissolution, nothing ever happened. And what this is the everything that apparently is nothing. But from within the manifestation, to say that this doesn't exist can become a delusion. So we can have a realization that in each moment everything dissolves back into nothing, and then spontaneously re-emerges as everything in such a way that it creates the experience of time and space. That can be a realization, but at some point we have to live life as if this is real. But ultimately somewhere with a deep understanding that even the sense of I am, the sense of existence, which is the only thing in the manifestation that remains constant, that everything else in the manifestation is objective and continually changing. The moment is never consistent. It's always in a state of flux. The physical objects are always changing. If we walk out of the room, even if we turn our head, the whole experience is continually different. The thoughts that we have, the emotions that we have, they're always changing. Nothing is ever consistently here, which means we can say nothing is truth on the basis that that which is real, that which is truth, never changes. So one of the practices is to come to see what we're not. And the suggestion is that everything that changes is not what we are. And that means that we look at objects and we say, oh, well, I can't be the objects, including the body, I can't be that. We look at feelings that are always changing, and we can come to the conclusion, I can't be the feelings, I can't be the emotions, I can't be the thoughts. So at some point, we might realize all the things that we are not, and at that point there could be a realization of that which remains ever present and unchanging in the manifestation. The suggestion is that it's the awareness that is aware of each moment, the awareness that is aware of the ever-changing experience that is ever present and unchanging, that there is never experience without an awareness of the experience, and that the awareness is the background for the ever-changing content of experience. And contained simultaneous with that awareness is the sense of existence, the sense of I am. And we can find that the content is ever changing, but this I amness, this awareness, is ever present. And so the statement is that there is only one truth in the manifestation, and that truth is the impersonal sense of I am and awareness. But when the manifestation collapses into absolute nothing, like in deep sleep, even that awareness and sense of existence collapses. So ultimately, even that which is ever present in the manifestation is seen to not be an absolute truth, because it too collapses in deep sleep and is not present. So that's where we come to the conclusion that there is no truth that is ever manifest, which then leads to the ultimate realization is that nothing really ever happened, because we start with nothing, all of this arises, and we end with nothing. So nothing plus everything equals nothing, which really means the everything ultimately is nothing. Having had that realization, let's live as Roger and Preman in this life, because that's what this nothing experience is about living as this. And so in practice, how do we live our life, understanding that really nothing is ever happening? And it's very simple and practical. In each moment, you have to do exactly what you think or feel you should do. Hopefully with the understanding that what feels like your free will is actually based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, turns out to be God's will, and then your will and God's will are not in opposition. They're not opposites, they're one and the same thing. And regardless of it being your will or God's will, the outcome is never in your control. Sometimes you get what you want, sometimes you don't. With the deep grounded in your being, there's the knowing that I don't need outcomes to be a certain way. It's only with the old belief of who I am that outcomes needed to be one way or the other. And that way we get to live as if this is real, doing in each moment what we think or feel we should do, without an attachment to outcomes, without regrets in the past, and without complaints in the present moment. That was Ramesh's answer to the question, knowing that everything is predetermined, how should I live my life?
So then with the death of the body, also the awareness disappears?
Yes. And so if we come to see life, it becomes clear that life is an experience, and when experience is present, there has to be awareness present also. Otherwise, the experience can't be recognized. But once the content falls away, then there's no question of awareness being there. You can have awareness present when there is awareness of nothing. But when there is awareness of nothing, then the nothing has actually become something, become an object that awareness is aware of. And that happens in deep meditation. You can have a sense of existence and awareness of nothing. The senses have fallen away, time and space has fallen away, and there's no objects in that deep meditation, yet awareness and existence remain. And that is a realization of the most basic form of the manifestation. And what can happen is we can shift into a deeper state. But what happens when there's a shifting into the deepest state, when I say we shift into a deeper state, actually there is a shifting into a deeper state where a we, including the definition of we or I as this most basic form of existence and awareness, when even that falls away. And so if that is death, then there's nothing to worry about, because there's absolutely no one to worry in that state. The worrying about death happens in the manifestation, when there is a belief about what death is and what it means to who I am. And so we've got an idea of death being a place where we might find ourselves judged by God, condemned to a life of misery in hell. Or we might have no idea and be completely scared of the uncertainty. Whereas to me, complete realization that life is experience. Life is the presence of experience. Experience that is recognized by an impersonal awareness. And with that understanding, death is known to be the absence of experience. And when there's the complete absence of experience, then even awareness falls away. So no question of death being a problem for anyone. Much like deep sleep. We've never had a problem in deep sleep. And so from that point of view, death is referred to in the scriptures and by those that have had a realization of the true nature of life as mahasamadhi. So a realization of self in daily living is samadhi, so peace in daily living. And death is referred to as the mahasamadhi, the ultimate, the super peace. Because even the struggle of daily living, the struggle of the flow of pleasure and pain has fallen away. The I that has to deal with the flow of life, even that falls away. The I and the flow of life. The ultimate peace. Doesn't sound nice?
If after death there is nothing, so how can some people get in touch with dead people, like mediums?
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah, so the experience of being in touch with dead people is an experience in the present moment. It's part of the experience. And the suggestion is that life is an experience that is designed to create a certain impression. So from nothing, this experience of life spontaneously arises. And it means that the ultimate cause is not at all cause and effect. The ultimate cause of the experience is immense creative potentiality, source, exploding into manifestation because it's potentiality. So at some point it has to manifest. And it manifests as this experience that is an experience designed to be an experience of time, designed to be an experience of cause and effect. But actually it's quite a magical projection in consciousness, like a dream. And so in each moment, consciousness could create whatever it wants. So I wouldn't be surprised, well, I would be surprised, but in theory, the next moment can have a big oak tree suddenly appear here. Because it's not, life is not what it seems. It's a creation, and it doesn't have to follow certain rules. Consciousness can create anything it wants. However, in this creation, it does follow rules in order to create a certain impression. So if has the experience of being in touch with someone who has died, our assumption is that that person exists. But actually it could be an impression created in this moment. An impression just like there is the impression that time and space exists. So in this moment, many of us, all of us, will have a memory of the past. That's maybe not exactly what we think it is. We assume that there is a memory because the past happened. When we look at it, maybe the past never happened. Maybe all there is this. And that the impression of a past exists because it's included as an object in this present moment. The particular object that we're talking about is memory. And memory has the power to create an impression of a past. And expectation is another object that has the power to create the impression of a future. And therefore the impression of time, past, present and future, comes into existence. But really we come to see that all there is the present moment. And so in the present moment can be designed such that a medium receives impulses, which are objects in this present moment. They are what the medium then describes as connection to a spirit, and it creates the impression that there is a spirit. It doesn't mean that there is. It just means that the creation is designed to create that impression. Life is an illusion. In the Vedic traditions, we're told that this is all a play of consciousness, and in some descriptions it's described as Maya, illusion or delusion. And we're told that life is not as it seems, life is an illusion. The illusion of personal doership is included to create a certain impression, to create the suffering that is intended to be there for a certain period of time. And furthermore, maybe this story of life is such that when the body dies, that there is another experience that happens after that. But to me, I wouldn't call that death. So if in a moment I get stabbed and suddenly I realize, wow, I'm losing consciousness, and this is how physical death of the body is going to happen. And at some point I lose consciousness and everything goes blank, let's say, which is my basic assessment of what happens when the body dies. Nothing. But then what if Roger comes back and he's sitting in a waiting room with a whole lot of other people, some people with bandages around their head, and other people with, all sorts of old age people. And then Roger looks down and sees this knife sticking out of his chest and realizes, oh, the body's much less solid than I'm used to. But the sense of Roger is still there. And then Roger says, oh, that's right, I died. And this must be heaven, or actually, no, this is the waiting room to decide whether I go to heaven or hell. But having realized what life is experience, life is the presence, the awareness of experience, that from my perspective, that I would not see where I was as death, but actually a continuation of life. That there was life on earth and now life in the waiting room. So that's not death. Death hasn't happened. And at some point, death, true death will happen, which will be the end of experience, whatever set of movement from one dimension to the other, if there are other dimension experiences. And so in theory, maybe there are other dimensions, so the body dies and I find myself in heaven or some middle place. Knowing that that's not death, that's life. And maybe a medium can communicate with me on that other realm. So maybe the medium is communicating with a spirit. But that spirit to me is still a continuation of life. And at some point, death will be the complete end of experience.
And this, when death comes, is it only when you know your true nature, or it can come at any moment?
I would say it comes at any moment. Many people die frustrated and unaware of the essence of who they really are.
How can you know that they are really dead and that they are not still in another space?
No, it's not about, to me, making an assessment as to whether there is life, a continuation of life or not, is not so important. It's more a realization of what life is, life being the presence of experience. And in coming to recognize that life is the presence of experience, there has to be a realization of what we are as the awareness that recognizes the experience. And that means liberation for us in this life, which is really what we're looking for. So one of the problems is when we become convinced, or when we're unclear on what we're really looking for, then we start asking a whole lot of irrelevant questions. Questions that we think are relevant, but when we really boil it down to what we're looking for in practical terms, we find what we're looking for is happiness for Roger in this life. And Roger for happiness in this life turns out to be the absence of suffering, the absence of this uncomfortableness with oneself and with the other. And when we look at what that uncomfortableness with oneself and with the other is, we find it's based on a whole lot of false beliefs of who we are and what we need. And it's when life starts to bring about the dissolving of these false ideas of who we are and what we need. Life brings about that when attention starts to fall on the truly relevant aspects of life. That's when we find we're happy. And so a lot of these other questions that we can spend lots of time seeking answers to, and we won't have definitive answers. So what I've put forward in this whole time is not the truth. Don't believe any of it. It's actually all just concepts which, from my own experience, were very useful concepts to dissolve the false beliefs that were in place. And once the false beliefs are dissolved, these concepts serve no more purpose. In my case, it seems like my destiny is to share the concepts, so they remain there relevant as information to share, but not for my happiness, because our happiness is simply the dissolving of ingrained beliefs. And so hopefully the concepts don't become a new set of beliefs. So I don't know what happens. I don't know what happens in 2 minutes' time. All that we can really know is that which is verifiable right now. And to me, what's verifiable right now is that this is experience, that it's ever changing, and that what I am, the I am that is the sense of existence, is the only thing that is ever present in experience, where I can undeniably say, I exist. What exists is undefinable. And so that becomes the truth in the manifestation. We're seeking truth. That's an intuitive feeling that we're seeking truth. And it turns out that to know the truth of what we are in the manifestation actually delivers happiness in the manifestation. So it's good enough to come into contact with the only truth that is undeniable in each moment, and that is the impersonal sense of I am. Everything else is just a concept. So, in order not to push my luck too far, I think we could bring today to an end. And if anyone has any other questions, this is on every day. Feel free to do exactly what you feel like. If you feel like coming, come. If you don't, there's plenty of other enjoyable things to do. So on that note, thank you everyone.